Somewhere in America right now, 10 legendary luxury cars are sitting almost forgotten, and most collectors will never lay eyes on a single one. Hit subscribe before we count them down, because number 1 has a story you won't believe. Number 10. Studebaker Avanti. The Studebaker Avanti arrived in 1962 as an act of desperation and genius in equal measure. The company was dying, sales collapsing, and in a last bid for relevance it commissioned designer Raymond Loewy to create something that had never been seen on an American road before. What emerged was a fiberglass-bodied fastback with no traditional grille, a cockpit-style interior, and a shape so forward-looking that people still mistake early photographs of it for a much later decade. It was fast for its time too, with an optional supercharged V8 that made it genuinely competitive against European sports coupes costing far more. Buyers in Chicago and Detroit who wanted something that whispered rather than shouted found themselves drawn to showrooms specifically to see it. But production quality suffered almost immediately. The fiberglass body panels were prone to poor fitment, and Studebaker's factory in South Bend was already in its final death spiral. Fewer than 6,000 were built before the plant closed entirely in December of 1963, barely a year after launch. What makes surviving examples so scarce today is not just the low production number but the fact that Studebaker's collapse meant no dealer network, no parts supply chain, and no manufacturer support for the decades that followed. Owners were left to fend for themselves, and a great many Avantis simply wore out and were scrapped because nobody could get the parts to keep them running. The ones that remain in original, unmolested condition are treated by collectors the way art historians treat an early canvas from a painter who died young, as the physical evidence of a brilliant idea cut off before it could fully mature. Even the story of the name itself carries a certain melancholy. A small group of dealers, unwilling to let the design simply disappear along with the company, bought the tooling and continued producing modified versions under new ownership for years afterward, using whatever engines they could still source. Purists consider only the original Studebaker-built cars from 1963 and early 1964 to be the true Avanti, and it is precisely those earliest examples, built in the final anxious months before the South Bend plant went silent forever, that command the most attention today. Tracking one down often means following a paper trail through estate auctions in small Indiana towns rather than glossy national sales. Number 9. Chrysler Imperial Crown Convertible. Imperial was Chrysler's answer to Cadillac and Lincoln, a marque built entirely around the idea that some buyers wanted something even the wealthy neighbor down the street didn't have. The Crown Convertible sat at the very top of that lineup through the early and mid-1960s, a car with a presence so commanding that period photographs show pedestrians on Fifth Avenue turning their heads mid-stride. It featured a distinctive gun sight, taillight design, and a dashboard finished with more switchgear and gauges than most contemporary aircraft cockpits. Buyers in places like Grosse Pointe and Beverly Hills ordered them not merely as transportation but as a kind of rolling statement about where the family stood. The ride was extraordinarily soft, cushioned by a suspension tuned specifically to erase the feeling of the road entirely, and the convertible top folded away with an almost theatrical mechanical sequence that neighbors would gather to watch. Imperial, though, never achieved the sales volume of Cadillac, and the convertible variant was always the rarest, most expensive configuration within an already low-volume marque. Fewer than a few thousand were built in most model years. As Imperial's fortunes declined through the decade, and as the brand was eventually folded back into the General Chrysler lineup by 1971, part support and factory documentation scattered and thinned. Combine that scarcity with the simple fact that convertibles were driven harder, exposed to weather more often, and more prone to structural rust around the rear quarters, and it becomes clear why finding one today in unrestored, numbers-matching condition feels like finding a message in a bottle. There is also a quieter reason so few remain. Imperial buyers, by nature, tended to keep their cars for decades rather than trading them in every few years, which meant that when a Crown convertible finally did leave the family, it was often already elderly, already tired, and already unfashionable by the standards of the 1970s. Rather than being restored, many were simply parked behind a garage or a barn and left to the weather, quietly forgotten by families who had long since moved on to newer cars. Decades later, when collectors finally came looking, what they found in those barns was often little more than a rusted shell with just enough original trim intact to confirm what it once had been. Number 8. Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz Convertible. By the early 1960s, Cadillac's Eldorado Biarritz convertible represented the absolute ceiling of what an American buyer could purchase without commissioning something custom-built entirely. It carried Cadillac's most powerful engine, its most elaborate trim, and a name borrowed from the fashionable French Basque Coast specifically to suggest a life of leisure most owners could only imagine, even as they lived it. Its tail fins, among the last truly dramatic fins Cadillac ever produced before styling softened later in the decade, made it instantly recognizable from blocks away. Doctors in Dallas, oil executives in Houston, and entertainers along the Sunset Strip all gravitated toward it as the definitive symbol of arrival. The interior smelled of leather so thick and supple that owners often remarked it felt more like the inside of a fine leather chair than a car seat. Power everything, from the windows to the seats to the convertible top itself, meant the driver barely had to move a muscle beyond a fingertip. Production numbers were never enormous to begin with, since the Biarritz was always priced well above the standard Eldorado coupe, and convertibles across the entire American industry faced the same vulnerabilities as the Imperial. Weather exposure, structural fatigue, and a tendency for that stunning bodywork to hide rust that quietly ate away at the frame beneath. Many were also used as promotional vehicles, driven hard and then discarded once the novelty faded. What remains in truly original condition, with the correct engine and unmolested trim, has become something dealers now describe not as inventory but as an occasion. Color combinations matter enormously to today's collectors as well, and this is where the scarcity compounds further. Certain factory paint and interior pairings were ordered so infrequently that a single surviving example in that exact combination might be the only one left in existence, its build sheet the only proof the pairing was ever offered at all. Enthusiasts spend years cross-referencing old dealer invoices and factory build records just to confirm whether a car for sale is genuinely what its seller claims, because the temptation to repaint a common color into a rarer one has proven, over the decades, difficult for some sellers to resist. Number 7. Lincoln Continental Convertible. No list of vanishing American luxury can skip past the Lincoln Continental convertible of the 1961 through 1967 era, the car most famous today for its rear-hinged, suicide doors that opened toward the center of the car rather than away from it. It was a design so architecturally bold that it is still referenced by car designers half a century later. Its clean, unornamented flanks a deliberate rejection of the chrome excess found elsewhere on American roads at the time. Kennedy-era Washington adored it. It became, almost accidentally, the car most associated with a certain kind of quiet East Coast establishment power, the sort of vehicle a senator's aide might arrange to have waiting outside a Georgetown townhouse. The convertible top, when lowered, folded into the trunk with a slow, almost ceremonial hydraulic sequence that could take the better part of a minute, drawing crowds of onlookers who had simply stopped to watch. Because of the historical weight attached to this specific body style, given that a Continental convertible was the very car in which President Kennedy was riding on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, many owners over the following decades either sold their cars or, in a strange twist, felt uneasy driving them at all. Some were retired from daily use and stored, which paradoxically helped preserve a portion of the surviving fleet, but the door mechanism itself was notoriously complex and expensive to maintain, and a great many convertibles fell into disrepair when owners simply couldn't justify the repair bills. Genuine, mechanically sound survivors with functioning suicide doors and an intact power top mechanism are now among the most painstakingly restored cars in the entire collector world. The 1967 model year in particular has become the quiet grail among Continental convertible hunters, since it was the final year the convertible body style was offered before Lincoln discontinued it altogether, and it carried subtle refinements the earlier cars lacked. Production for that last year dropped to just a few thousand units, and today, tracking down a genuinely correct 1967 convertible with its original vinyl top mechanism still functioning as intended can take a dedicated collector years of patient searching through small estate sales and word-of-mouth leads passed quietly between longtime Lincoln Club members. Number 6. Buick Riviera Gran Sport. The Buick Riviera arrived in 1963 to prove that a division known for comfortable, sensible cars could build something with genuine attitude. Its razor-edged styling, inspired partly by the profile of a Rolls-Royce, gave it a European elegance that stood apart from the rest of Buick's lineup, and the Gran Sport variant added a firmer suspension, a more aggressive engine tune, and just enough attitude to appeal to buyers who wanted luxury without appearing to have gone soft. It found its audience among younger professionals in Los Angeles and Chicago who wanted something that photographed beautifully parked outside a restaurant but still had genuine performance underneath. The dashboard wrapped around the driver in a way that felt distinctly aviation-inspired, all business despite the plush surroundings, and the exhaust note carried a low, confident growl that set it apart from the hush of most luxury cars of the era. The Gran Sport package, however, was always a minority option within an already specialized model, chosen by a relatively small fraction of Riviera buyers who wanted the sportier character. Many surviving Rivieras have long since lost their original Gran Sport-specific components, since owners swapped in more common parts over the decades when originals became difficult to source. Finding one today with its correct factory engine, its original suspension tuning, and undocumented trim intact requires searching through estate sales and small regional car clubs rather than the larger, more visible national auction houses. Buick itself never kept especially detailed production breakdowns separating the Gran Sport package from standard Rivieras of the same model year, which means modern collectors often rely on decoding factory build tags riveted inside the door jamb just to confirm authenticity. That lack of clean documentation has, over the years, made the model a favorite target for well-intentioned but historically inaccurate restorations, where a standard Riviera is dressed up with Gran Sport badging and equipment it never originally carried, further muddying the already thin population of verifiably genuine cars. Number 5. Oldsmobile Toronado. When Oldsmobile introduced the Toronado in 1966, it did something genuinely radical for an American luxury car. It sent power exclusively to the front wheels, a layout almost unheard of in a large domestic car at the time. Engineers had to solve problems nobody in Detroit had seriously tackled in decades, and the result was a car that handled with a flatness and predictability that stunned road testers used to the wallowing ride of typical American luxury sedans. Its styling matched the mechanical ambition, with hidden headlights that rotated into view and a low, muscular stance that made it look like it was moving even parked at the curb outside a restaurant in Scottsdale or a country club in suburban Michigan. Engineers and early adopters in particular gravitated toward it, drawn by the sheer novelty of the engineering achievement as much as the styling. The complexity that made the Toronado so remarkable is precisely what made it so difficult to keep alive. The front-wheel drive transaxle system was unlike anything else on the road, meaning specialized parts and specialized mechanics were required almost from day one, and as the decades passed and Oldsmobile itself eventually vanished as a brand entirely in 2004, the pool of technicians who genuinely understood the original drivetrain shrank dramatically. Many were simply parked once something broke, because nobody nearby could fix it. Original, functioning first-generation Toronados with their correct drivetrain intact are now genuinely rare, sought after as much for their engineering significance as their styling. Because the car's engineering was so far ahead of anything Oldsmobile had built before, a portion of the earliest production run was quietly used for internal testing and demonstration purposes rather than sold to the public, meaning true first-year 1966 examples that saw genuine customer ownership are scarcer than the official production totals might suggest. Engineers who worked on the original program have said in later interviews that they never expected the car to remain such a novelty decades later. They assumed front-wheel drive would simply become the industry standard within a few years. It took considerably longer than that, which only adds to the sense that the Toronado was a car built slightly ahead of its own time. Number 4. Cadillac Fleetwood 75 Limousine. Unlike the more commonly seen Cadillac sedans of the era, the Fleetwood 75 limousine was built for an entirely different purpose, transporting the genuinely powerful, the extraordinarily wealthy, or, in a great many surviving examples, the recently deceased. Stretched dramatically beyond the standard Cadillac wheelbase, it offered rear-seat passengers a division window, jump seats, and a sense of ceremony that no standard sedan could match. Funeral homes and livery services in cities like New Orleans and Chicago purchased them by the fleet, and a smaller number went to private buyers wealthy enough to want a chauffeur-driven car of genuine substance. Riding in the rear compartment felt less like being in a car, and more like being in a small, well-appointed room that happened to be moving, insulated from road noise so thoroughly that conversation could continue at a whisper. Because such a large proportion of the surviving fleet spent its working life in commercial funeral or livery service, most examples were driven hundreds of thousands of miles, maintained only to the standard necessary to keep working, and eventually scrapped once they became uneconomical to repair. Private, personally owned examples that were treated with genuine care rather than worked into the ground are exceptionally uncommon, and the extended wheelbase itself makes restoration a far more expensive and specialized undertaking than a standard sedan, discouraging all but the most committed collectors from attempting it. There is also an emotional hesitation that surrounds this particular model that doesn't apply to most other collector cars. A meaningful share of surviving Fleetwood 75s are former funeral coaches or flower cars, and some collectors are simply reluctant to take on a vehicle with that specific history attached, regardless of how mechanically sound it might be. Dedicated Cadillac limousine clubs have worked for years to document and preserve the surviving examples specifically because of this reluctance, treating each roadworthy 75 less as a used car and more as a piece of civic and social history that deserves to be kept running rather than left to quietly disappear. Number 4. Cadillac Fleetwood 75 Limousine. Unlike the more commonly seen Cadillac sedans of the era, the Fleetwood 75 limousine was built for an entirely different purpose: transporting the genuinely powerful, the extraordinarily wealthy, or, in a great many surviving examples, the recently deceased. Stretched dramatically beyond the standard Cadillac wheelbase, it offered rear-seat passengers a division window, jump seats, and a sense of ceremony that no standard sedan could match. Funeral homes and livery services in cities like New Orleans and Chicago purchased them by the fleet, and a smaller number went to private buyers wealthy enough to want a chauffeur-driven car of genuine substance. Riding in the rear compartment felt less like being in a car, and more like being in a small, well-appointed room that happened to be moving, insulated from road noise so thoroughly that conversation could continue at a whisper. Because such a large proportion of the surviving fleet spent its working life in commercial funeral or livery service, most examples were driven hundreds of thousands of miles, maintained only to the standard necessary to keep working, and eventually scrapped once they became uneconomical to repair. Private, personally owned examples that were treated with genuine care rather than worked into the ground are exceptionally uncommon, and the extended wheelbase itself makes restoration a far more expensive and specialized undertaking than a standard sedan, discouraging all but the most committed collectors from attempting it. There is also an emotional hesitation that surrounds this particular model that doesn't apply to most other collector cars. A meaningful share of surviving Fleetwood 75s are former funeral coaches or flower cars, and some collectors are simply reluctant to take on a vehicle with that specific history attached, regardless of how mechanically sound it might be. Dedicated Cadillac limousine clubs have worked for years to document and preserve the surviving examples specifically because of this reluctance, treating each roadworthy 75 less as a used car and more as a piece of civic and social history that deserves to be kept running rather than left to quietly disappear. Number 2. Cadillac Eldorado Brougham, 1965–66. If the standard Eldorado represented the top of American luxury, the Brougham of 1965 and 1966 represented something else entirely: a nearly hand-built flagship, produced in numbers so small that most Cadillac dealers across the country never had one in stock at all. Buyers ordered it specifically, often waiting months, and received in return a car finished to a standard closer to a custom coach-built automobile than anything else rolling off an American assembly line at the time. Stainless steel roof panels, a stretched wheelbase, and an interior trimmed with details more commonly associated with a fine study than a car set it apart even from other Cadillacs. It became the preferred vehicle of a small circle of genuinely elite buyers, industrialists and old money families in places like Palm Beach and Lake Forest, who wanted something that few other people in the country could simply walk into a dealership and purchase. Total production across both model years numbered only in the low hundreds, an almost unbelievably small figure for a major American manufacturer. Because so few were built in the first place, and because the car's complexity made repairs both expensive and difficult to source correctly, a meaningful percentage of the surviving fleet has been altered, mismatched with incorrect parts over the years, or simply lost to time. A genuinely correct, unrestored example is now one of the rarest finds in the entire American collector market. Adding further to its mystique, the Brougham's stainless steel roof was supplied by an outside specialist rather than fabricated in-house, a detail Cadillac rarely advertised but one that meant the panel itself required an entirely separate, specialized repair process if it was ever damaged or corroded. Very few body shops in the country, then or now, have ever actually worked on one. Some owners over the decades, unable to find anyone qualified to repair a damaged roof panel correctly, simply replaced it with painted steel instead, meaning that even among the small number of surviving Broughams, cars with their original, correct stainless roof intact are rarer still. Number 1. Lincoln Continental Executive Limousine. Which brings us to the car that tops this list, not because of tail fins or horsepower, but because of sheer, almost absurd scarcity. The Lincoln Continental Executive Limousine of the 1960s was not built by Ford on a standard assembly line at all. Instead, finished Continental sedans were sent to specialist coach builders, most notably Lehmann-Peterson in Chicago, who cut the cars in half, extended them by several feet, reinforced the structure, and rebuilt them into stately, formal limousines suitable for heads of state and the very highest tier of American business leadership. These were the cars that carried presidents in parades, that waited outside the United Nations, that ferried corporate boards to meetings where decisions affecting entire industries were made in hushed, wood-paneled rear compartments. Each one was effectively a custom commission, built to order in numbers that rarely exceeded a few dozen units per year across the entire run, making total surviving production almost impossibly small. Because these cars were built through a separate, specialized coach-building process entirely outside Ford's standard manufacturing and part system, there was never a conventional dealer network equipped to service or restore them once their working lives ended. Many were used by government agencies, corporations, or livery services until they were simply worn out, then scrapped rather than restored, since no ordinary Lincoln dealer had the expertise or the extended body panels required to bring one back. A genuine, documented Lehmann-Peterson Continental limousine surfacing today is treated by serious collectors less as a car sale and less as a purchase, and more as the recovery of a piece of American institutional history that very nearly vanished entirely. Lehmann-Peterson itself only operated for roughly a decade before closing its doors in the early 1970s, and when it did, much of its production paperwork, engineering drawings, and customer records were scattered or lost entirely, leaving today's collectors and historians to piece together which specific cars went to which government agencies or corporations using little more than old newspaper photographs and fragments of correspondence. For a handful of surviving limousines, nobody alive today can say with total certainty exactly whose motorcade they once rode in, which only deepens the strange, quiet reverence collectors feel standing next to one. Taken together, these 10 cars tell a story that goes well beyond horsepower figures and chrome trim. Each one represents a moment when American manufacturing was willing to build something almost recklessly ambitious, whether that meant Studebaker gambling its last resources on a fiberglass fastback, or Cadillac hand finishing a flagship it knew would only ever reach a few hundred buyers. That same ambition, though, carried the seeds of its own scarcity. Low production numbers, specialized engineering, coach-built construction, and the simple hard use these cars endured in their working lives all combined to thin the surviving fleet down to a fraction of what was originally built. There is something quietly moving about that fact. These were never meant to be rare. They were meant to be driven, enjoyed, worn in gradually the way any well-made object earns its character over years of use. Their rarity today is really just the accumulated weight of decades of ordinary decisions, a limousine finally deemed too expensive to fix, a convertible left uncovered through one too many wet winters, a set of original parts swapped out simply because nothing else was available at the time. None of it was dramatic. It simply added up. And that is precisely why finding one today, sitting quietly under a car cover in someone's garage or rolling gently into a small regional car show, feels like such an occasion. These machines have survived not because they were protected, but almost in spite of the fact that they weren't, at least not deliberately. What remains is a small, stubborn handful of American luxury at its most confident, still here, still whole, still carrying the particular hush of a bygone decade behind every closed door. It is worth remembering, too, that scarcity like this rarely announces itself while it is happening. Nobody standing on a showroom floor in 1965, admiring the stainless roof of a new Eldorado Brougham or the folding top of a Continental convertible, imagined they were looking at a car that would one day become a genuine rarity. These were simply the best cars a wealthy American could buy that particular year, expected to be replaced eventually by something newer and better, the way luxury goods always are. It was only decades later, once the factories closed, the coach builders shuttered, and the parts bins finally emptied for good, that anyone recognized what had quietly slipped away. That is, in many ways, the truest lesson these 10 cars offer. Greatness is rarely obvious in the moment it is made. It only becomes obvious once it becomes rare. Thank you for spending this time with us. If any of these cars brought back a memory, a story your own family passed down, or simply a moment of genuine appreciation for what Detroit was once capable of building, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through America's vanishing luxury cars, please like this video and subscribe for more stories from the golden age of the American automobile. Until next time.